Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how you doing?
Boy, I am doing great, and we're in high summer.
We are. We are there.
You know what amazes me, John, is I love watching the plants grow. You know, the days are so long, and the squash vines are running like crazy. And everything is it grows so rapidly in these long days. Temperature is good. We've had some moisture, and it's just amazing. I just love reveling in at this point of summer.
Yeah, and the heat's kind of we're at a good place with the heat now. I mean, everything's kind of appropriate. It seems like this is where we should be for summer, so that it's a good time of the year.
It is. So I am happy.
Well, before we get too far, we want to let you know that this podcast is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. You can find them 1 mile south of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 off Exit 6, just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead. Hey, Don, we're talking about, kind of summer just kind of racing along. What's the fastest vegetable?
I don't know.
The runner bean.
Of course.
Well, like we said, this summer is just kind of cruising by. I mean, it's really everything's going at a great pace now. And we're at the 4th of July. We're at this time of the year. And while it's a national holiday, it's kind of a significant day for gardeners too, isn't it?
It is. It is Independence Day for gardeners.
Yeah.
And now the first time I heard that phrase, it was coined by Neil Holland, who, wonderful professor of horticulture, owner of garden centers, wonderful basic horticulture, salt of the earth. And so it's fun to pass along the wisdom of old, experienced gardeners, and it's fun to keep that wisdom alive. So I don't know if he originated that phrase or not, but he's the one that made it most popular. So July 4th, Independence Day for gardeners, because there are certain things that we stop doing.
Yeah. So, that's what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about the things that as gardeners we no longer have to do, but then also some things that maybe will,
we do need to continue.
Exactly, because there's never really, we've got a long way to go until it's total hands-off downtime.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's not really a point at which you're done.
Right.
and of course, that's fun. I always think, the process is part of the fun.
Yeah.
So, Independence Day, we stop doing some things, but we're not done.
Yeah. So let's kind of jump in. Let's talk about some topics, some things that we can stop doing around the 4th of July. And again, we're not saying the 4th is the hard date, but at this time of the year now, you can look at these things. You can stop doing some of these things. And one of the things that you should stop doing is fertilizing perennial flowers, shrubs, and young trees, right?
It is. And the reason for that is fertilizer is a great growth stimulator. And if we fertilize during the last half of the summer, our trees, shrubs, perennial flowers, it causes a spurt of growth. And that spurt of growth might not have time to harden off or toughen up in time for wintertime. And for example, on a tree, if you fertilize during the last half of the summer after July 4th, it would cause that spurt of growth, and that young flush of tender leaves and twigs has a great possibility of freezing back in wintertime. So the last half of the summer is spent with these plants kind of hardening off and getting ready for winter.
Is there anything that we should be doing now that to help these plants harden off? I mean, should we also be cutting back on watering?
That's a good question. Yeah. In tapering off on water, would that kind of help toughen them up? And it would, except later on in the season, that helps. But right now in the middle of summertime, they do need their water for continued growth and to kind of continue that hardening off process. They do need moisture for that.
And because obviously...
But that's a good point. Later in the season, then we taper off on watering for a bit into August and then water again in the fall.
Yeah.
Good point, John.
Because now, I mean, like the sun is at its peak, so they're getting so much energy from the sun. You really need that water to work in tandem with the energy from the sun.
Exactly. When you mention the sun, that also brings up the good point. Trees and shrubs are smart. they start detecting the shorter days, and I hate to say that, but after June 21st, the days slightly start decreasing, and trees and shrubs can detect that shortening day length, and that is the trigger to start getting ready for winter. But we got a lot of good growing, so I hate to even mention winter.
Yeah, we won't mention the W word.
No.
But yeah, the things will be changing, and then let's all enjoy
trees
July.
Start that gradual process.
Speaking of fertilizing, we've talked about this before, that this is not a good time to fertilize your lawn.
Correct. For a couple of reasons. One is, of course, the heat, because if you fertilize in the heat of the summer, it can actually burn. And the other is if your lawn has gone a little bit dormant from dryness, then the fertilizer will also add a stress to it. If you are keeping your lawn well watered with a sprinkler system, there are some lawn care companies who will give a July fertilizing, kind of a 4-time-a-year process. But that has to be used very cautiously, only on lawns that are actively growing. For most of us, the middle of summer is not the time to fertilize.
So it's not the time to fertilize, but could you still throw down some seed if you've got a dead spot, if something happened, or if you had to remove a patch of grass? Could you still throw down some seed and try to grow some grass from seed?
You can, as long as you keep the moisture really, really good. I think I mentioned one of our past podcasts that my wife Mary and I seeded the entire lawn of St. Anthony's Church on Fargo's 10th Street in July, just because it needed to be done. But as I mentioned that time, we watered religiously. And so if you do keep the water up there, such as 2 or 3 times a day, the grass seed will sprout and be successful. Or you can pause and wait until September. Good time also for grass seeding.
Another thing we've talked about kind of a little bit, it's also not a good time to be pruning shrubs, to be pruning trees, right?
And for the same reason that we talked about the fertilizing trees and shrubs, because pruning also stimulates a flush of new growth. When you prune something back, the tree or shrub's response is to send out a bunch of new growth. And that new growth might not have time to toughen up or harden off during the last half of the summer in time for fall. So generally, pruning should not be done. But here's an exception. On hedges, formally trimmed hedges, I've got an alpine currant hedge that I like. It does beautifully. And so that formal type hedge, oftentimes you will still need to do some trimming in midsummer. I need to do ours now. Otherwise, they start getting kind of gangly, but that's a separate situation.
And that's really that's called shaping, right?
Shaping, shearing,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. And because you're not going too deep, you're not looking to cut off limbs.
You hit the nail on the head. You're just kind of trimming back the wayward shoots, the little sprouts on the end.
All right, well, we're going to take a quick little break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about more things that we can stop doing on our Independence Day for gardeners.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
Okay, we're back, and we're talking about Independence Day for gardeners and the things that we can stop doing. Things that we can stop doing in the yard, because now that we're in July, we've had all this buildup. We've been getting our yards ready, our gardens ready, and now we can we shift a little bit into kind of not building up, but just kind of maintenance and upkeep, right?
Exactly. So that frees us up from some duties to devote our time to other duties.
Now, one of the things that while we're looking at for some plants and some crops that we're going to be harvesting, there are some harvesting of things that we can now stop on and that we really should stop on. And one of those is asparagus, right? We should kind of quit picking the asparagus.
Yep, July 4th is kind of the cutoff for harvesting asparagus. Up until this time, you can keep cutting off the spears as they form. But after July 4th, it's time to stop that harvest. And here's why. Asparagus is very generous to us in that as soon as those spears appear out of the ground, it lets us cut them off and enjoy the flavor of fresh asparagus. Isn't that wonderful, John? Fresh asparagus, I love it. So anyway, we are cutting off all of its photosynthesis ability up until July 4th. So after July 4th, it needs to grow its stems and its fine little fern-like leaves in order to do its photosynthesis thing and recharge its root system so it'll be in good shape for next year, next spring again. If we continued to cut it off, it would have no way to photosynthesize and it might not come back. So we enjoy asparagus the first half, and then we reward it by letting it grow naturally the rest of the summer.
Yeah, this is a really good example about what you're talking about with hardening off. With now you give these plants a time to really store their energy and work towards next year, because asparagus, will start depending on the weather, but asparagus is really one of the first things to come out of the ground almost, isn't it, in the spring?
Yeah, and that's what's fun. You mentioned harvesting other vegetables. In the middle of summer, you start coming into like this green beans and all of the nice garden vegetables. So yeah, at that point, asparagus has rewarded us with that early season fresh vegetable.
Another one that you can stop harvesting is rhubarb, right?
Yeah, for the same reason. We enjoy those stalks of fresh rhubarb for the first half of the season, but for the same reason as asparagus, we need to stop the harvest. And when you think about it, these plants like rhubarb are so generous to us. Just think their goal in life is to do photosynthesis with their leaves and, go merrily along their way. But they allow us to pluck off their stems and leaves and enjoy them. And so like I enjoy saying, the last half of the summer is our gift back to them. Let them grow, let the leaves, let the stems be. It'll produce the energy down to give us a reward again next spring. But if we keep plucking it off, that's awfully hard on those plants. And so at some point in the summer, getting towards fall, if you're hungry for a rhubarb pie, well, then certainly, don't take off more than half at any given time, but it won't kill the plant. Another opportunity is when they're expecting a killing frost in the fall that's going to kill those leaves anyway, well, then go ahead and harvest some rhubarb. But it's important, though. I oftentimes get this question, can you eat frosted rhubarb, whether it happens in the spring or in the fall? Because there's always a rumor that goes around that if rhubarb has been exposed to frost, it's poisonous. Because the reason we don't eat rhubarb leaves is because they do have a toxin. We only eat the stems. And if rhubarb has been exposed to frost, there's a possibility that that toxin would move into the stem. But here's how you know if it's safe. If the rhubarb is good and firm, if the stalks are good and firm, it's safe. But if it's wilted or the leaves are crisp or have looked like they've been affected by frost, then don't eat it.
And that's, I think with rhubarb, people have a lot of questions because also you shouldn't eat rhubarb. It's like the first year it's planted, right?
Yeah, you're right. In fact, in order to let rhubarb kind of get a big husky root system, we should plant it and let it grow the first season and the second season, and then enjoy harvesting the third season. So let it grow for 2 full years. That's a good question because sometimes you're so tempted to start enjoying that. But if you pluck off the stems too early, then you're sacrificing some of the growth of that plant. But on the upside of that is with a little bit of patience, that rhubarb will probably be there for the next 100 years or so.
Yeah, they are a tough plant, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. It's kind of fun on some of the older homesteads to still see the rhubarb there.
So, and there's a couple different kinds of rhubarb, right? There's based on color or?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And you're right. Usually it's kind of graded or based by color. The older maybe heritage types tended to have a kind of a bigger stalk, maybe more greenish. The cultivars that were developed, such as Valentine and Canada Red, have a redder, as the name implies, a redder stalk. Now, I got to tell you about my rhubarb.
Yeah.
Okay, my grandma ordered probably from the Gurney's Company, and actually that one is 100 years ago, old, but she ordered from the Gurney's catalog a beautiful rhubarb. And this rhubarb, she planted out at her farm by Fingal. And my mom then moved one of those plants to Lisbon. And then I moved one of the plants to Fargo. And it has a very beautiful total red look to it. And yeah, so beautiful. It is. It's fun to have these heritage type things like rhubarb.
Yeah, rhubarb's always a fun thing to have around. I mean, because it's kind of hands off too. Once you've established it, I mean, you don't have to keep it super watered. It can
Exactly.
do pretty well on.
It does well with a little extra fertilizer, but yeah, it thrives on its own.
And it does fine in shade. Yeah,
exactly.
Talking about digging up those plants and moving them, it's also not a good time necessarily to be digging and dividing plants, is it?
Exactly. Like the perennials that we'd kind of like to dig, divide, maybe move around. The middle of summer is the time to lay off on that. There are 2 times of year to divide perennials, in the spring and then again in the fall. And the way to remember which type should you do in the spring, which type in the fall, is by their blooming. For example, if a perennial blooms in the spring of the year or early summer, then you dig and divide that in the fall. Think peonies.
Okay.
Blooming in the early part of summer, you dig and divide those in September. Iris is kind of towards the end of summer, early fall too. If it's a fall blooming such as mums, then you do those in the spring. So the idea is dig and divide opposite the season in which it blooms. But in the middle of summer, when we get the heat and things like that, then that's not really the time to move any of those. An exception might be daylilies. Daylilies are so vigorous and thrifty, they kind of let us move them almost any time.
And hostas seem that way too.
Hostas are much like that too.
Yeah.
If we have our preference, they can be moved usually in spring,
okay,
when they're first kind of sending out little shoots. But yeah, hostas are much like that too. If you absolutely need to move a perennial, such as if you're moving or something like that.
Or construction or something like that.
Yeah, then, and if you have the spot prepared, even though this isn't the season, prepare the spot ahead of time that you're going to move it to, and then dig that perennial and get it to its new spot as quick as you can. Don't even give it time to think about wilting. Maybe put it in a bucket or an old pot or something, and then get it to its new spot, plant it, and then water immediately. Almost act as though it's bleeding because those roots can't be exposed to air for very long. So it can be done, but the faster you do it and get some water on it immediately.
Really transplant.
Exactly.
Yeah. Almost like a surgery, yes.
Yeah.
The other thing we talked a little bit about that you shouldn't be fertilizing the lawn. Also, you shouldn't be treating lawns with chemicals for weeds, right?
Exactly, because now our lawns will tolerate certain types of weed killers. There are weed killers that are just specific to broadleaf, such as dandelions and that, and the lawn grass isn't affected. But in the heat of the summer, the middle of summer, and when things get a little dry, then those lawn herbicides that normally wouldn't harm a lawn can have adverse effect. So generally, weed control in the middle of summer, take your independence from that and wait until the fall and then do your lawn weed treatment.
And the other thing, one more thing, the things that we shouldn't be doing or can hold off on, it's not a good time to be planting trees, right?
It is. And when I pause a little bit because trees, shrubs, potted perennials can be planted in the middle of summer as long as you use some caution.
Okay.
If it's going to be 100 degrees and a 50-mile-an-hour wind, then definitely hold off. A danger can be that when you plant such as tree and keep it watered, well, sometimes the tree can't pump that water up to the leaves as fast as needed. And then we can get some browning and crisping on the leaves. So I've planted trees and shrubs in the middle of summer, but be really cautious. Cautious as in keep it well watered, but don't overwater. Don't water every day, but check that soil. Check the original soil, the pot that was in the pot. Check that original root ball and never let that get real dry. So I don't totally rule out planting in midsummer, but we do need to use caution and try to pick your days or pick your weeks. Even if it's nice one day, if it's going to have a long hot stretch, then I'd delay, because we have a good opportunity in late summer and fall to do our planting also.
All right. Well, since that sounds like a good time to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the gardening and lawn chores that you should keep up on during this heat of
because
summer.
even though we're laying off on some things, it's a good time to do others.
When you can't make it to City Hall or school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
All right, we're back with our Independence Day for Gardeners episode, and we've talked about the things that you no longer have to do now that we're into July. But let's talk about some things that you really want to stay on top of, or things that you should start doing. One of those is that you should continue to fertilize annual flowers and container plants. We said that, you shouldn't be fertilizing the shrubs and things like that and the lawn, but container plants, especially and annuals, you really should stay on top of those.
Right, because they reward us with their bloom for this season. We aren't trying to overwinter those. And so the more nutrition we can give them, that is going to give us the biggest show for the remainder of this season. And since these annuals and things that we grow in containers or flower beds, they're heavy feeders. The more nutrition they get, the more blossoms they'll put out. So continue fertilizing with water-soluble types are always readily available to the plants. And every 7 to 10 days is probably a good track record. Now, maybe steer clear to the heat of the day, because some of these liquid-type fertilizers that get on the leaves could cause burning, so choose early morning or evening.
Right, and speaking of those flowering plants, deadheading is something that we should also stay on top of, because that's really going to help out in a number of ways, won't it?
It does, because an annual's goal in life is to produce seed, which will carry on the generation because the mother plant is going to die when winter comes. And so if they start setting seed, that will be a trigger to the plant to start slowing down. It'll know that its goal in life is kind of nearing its end, and it won't produce as many more flowers. So if we can continue to cut off or remove the seed heads, it'll keep that annual plant trying. It'll keep producing more buds, more flowers, and we'll enjoy it longer into the season. So a couple of plants this is especially important for. One is geraniums. The old flower head as it sits there, it looks kind of ugly anyway. And right. If it progresses, it'll start setting seed. So with geraniums, instead of clipping them off with the scissors, there's a point at which you can remove that geranium flower. Okay, so grab the geranium flower with its stalk, and then just move your hand down to a point where that stalk meets the stem. And then bend it kind of outward. And when you try this, you'll say, oh yeah, now I know what Kinsler means. So snap it off, and you don't need the scissors. Snap that geranium flower off. And the reason for not just cutting it off is you'll leave a part of that stem, flower stalk, on, and that flower stalk can be a way for disease to kind of enter in. Geraniums can be susceptible to kind of mildew-type diseases. So snap those blossoms off down at their point of origin where that stalk meets the main stem, and you'll see exactly what I mean on that. And other flowers, such as petunias, that can be a chore to deadhead petunias. There's
a lot of them.
There's a lot of those. Sometimes I'm asked, well, okay, I see the dried petunia petals. Is that enough? Am I just pulling those up? But no. In addition to the faded dried petals, there is a green enlargement, which is the seed capsule. And for example, on petunias, that's what you need to take off, is that enlarging green seed capsule that you see. So it's not enough just to pluck off the dried blossoms. Now, in marigolds, those below the dried little petals, you'll see an enlarging seed capsule. And so then you just pinch off that whole old dead flower containing the seeds, and that'll keep them blooming better. So, we do what we can. You don't want it to become such a terrible, terrible burden. Trying to deadhead a big hanging basket full of wave petunias can be quite a task, but do what you can. But geraniums is fairly easy, and some of the container-grown plants are easier. A flower bed is more of a challenge to deadhead.
All right. Well, let's talk about some. We talked about harvesting rhubarb and asparagus. It's not necessarily great. We should cut back on that in July, but that other harvests, things that we should be getting ready for, and other fruits and vegetables that we're growing, some things that we need to start taking care of there. And one of those is if you're growing potato plants, you should hill up the soil around that. What does that mean? Hill up the soil.
Hill up the soil. That means pulling the soil from between the rows up around the plants. If you've ever driven past a commercial potato field, before the potato vines fully cover the soil, you'll notice that the row is kind of deeper down in between rows, the soil's kind of deeper down in. Well, they've gone along with machines and pulled the soil up out of, in between the row and mounded it up around the base of the plants. So when I do our potato patch in our garden, and I'm hungry for fresh potatoes. I can't wait. So anyway, in our potato patch, in between the rows, I go along with my garden hoe and I pull the soil up and mound it up around each plant. That does a couple of things. That helps encourage the tuber formation. And also, if you don't do that, you're more apt to get potato tubers that are exposed as they form, and then they turn green. And so then when you go to dig them up, those that are too close to the surface are green. But when you mound them up, you get a better tuber formation, and then they don't turn green from exposure to the sunlight.
And what kind of potatoes are you growing? You said you're hungry for them.
Boy.
You're growing.
I love the red Norland, which was developed at NDSU probably in the 1950s, which is a wonderful smooth skin red. I love Norland. Pontiac is a good old one that gives great big, huge red skin potatoes. And Kennebec is a nice, productive white skin. And then a russet potato. I'm doing the a russet Burbank this year.
Okay.
Is the one that I'm trying. And Yukon Gold is the other one, which is a yellow-fleshed potato.
So you've really got a variety of potatoes
I'm German.
out there.
We need our potatoes.
Another vegetable that we should be working on too is we should be adding mulch around carrots, right?
Yes, the mulch around carrots to keep them nice and moist. And sometimes if moisture fluctuates too much around carrots, for example, if it gets a little dry, then we get a rain, and carrots will oftentimes split. They'll get a burst of growth when you get moisture, and that will cause them to almost just burst their britches, and you get cracking. The same thing happens on tomatoes. When you get a burst of moisture following a little bit of a dry spell, the skin will crack. So ways to prevent the cracking or splitting of some of these vegetables is to keep the soil more uniformly moist, and that's what the mulch does. It helps prevent the swings in moisture from dryness to good moisture. And so anytime we can mulch the garden this time of year, it really does a great job.
And how much mulch should we be adding?
Probably at least 2 inches or so to the surface. And that brings up the question, well, what do we use to mulch on these? Well, one of the handiest is just grass clippings. When we talk about lawns, we advocate not bagging the clippings because those mulches are good for the lawn. But a good use for lawn clippings that you've bagged up is in the garden. Now, one of the key features is that points is that you have not treated those clippings with lawn herbicide. Because if you bag up lawn clippings that have been treated with herbicide, weed killers, that can translate or transmit damage into the vegetable garden. So only use non-treated grass clippings, and a couple inches of those over the soil between the rows and around plants really does well.
So since we're talking,
if you don't have that, I should mention another alternative: straw that you're sure has not been treated with herbicide. Straw works well. and
bark mulch.
Bark mulch, that works well. And some of the finely shredded material, then you can work that into the soil at the end of the season too.
Since we're talking about lawns, we should still be mowing with a higher, about 3 inches or so, right?
All season, all summer, and well into the fall, we should maintain a high mowing height of about 3 inches.
So when it gets this, when we're when we're in this peak of summer, when the sun is at its peak and we're getting good moisture and it's warm, how often should we be mowing? I mean, should we just mow every time it gets over 3 inches, or should we let it go a little bit more because it's getting hot and let it kind of dig down a little bit more? How often should we be mowing?
Of course, the advantage of mowing at 3 inches and no shorter is that the taller mowing height will shade the roots. It helps conserve moisture, helps block out weeds, and so there's a lot of good reasons for doing that. And in the heat of summer, you can just imagine the roots are cooler down there if we keep that mowing height. And so the rule of thumb kind of is whenever you mow, it's healthiest for the grass if you don't remove about 1/3 of the grass clippings. So maybe let it get to 4 inches, then mow down to 3. That would kind of work well. And so without letting it too long, but, let it grow an inch. Sometimes we're asked, well, gosh, if you mow at 3 inches, doesn't that mean I'm going to have to be mowing more? And actually, no, because if you mow low, well, then it grows. You have to mow again, too. So whatever height you're at, you're still going to have to mow. And research has actually shown that maintaining it at 3 inches, you're actually mowing less often than if you're cutting it low and shearing. And cutting it low is a recipe for having that lawn turn brown quicker and being greatly stressed in the middle of summer.
Well, since we're talking about, a healthy lawn as a way to kind of cut out some weeds, we should also stay on weeding. I mean, I hate to say it, but that's kind of a season-long task, isn't it?
Yeah, in the flower beds and the garden, the vegetable garden. Yeah, weeding. Yeah, I do find it fascinating because it's like you're on a mission. And the reason a person's on the mission is because these weeds can seed themselves so greatly. And one weed plant can produce so many seeds, thousands. Some of them tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. I think purslane has been recorded at doing something like 100,000 seeds per plant is possible. So anyway, those seeds will populate your soil for years to come with weeds. So letting a couple escape, you're just populating the soil with seeds, weed seeds, that are going to haunt you for years and years. So that's why I'm on a mission. And, it's interesting. I was out weeding in our flower garden the other night, and I can tell spots that I did not get to those weeds last year and let them seed, because then in a surrounding area, and I remember which ones I maybe let slip, and in a circular area, the weed seeds are thick, the weeds sprouting up. And so, I just can tell if I've gotten lax, then those are the areas that I've got worse weeds than the following year.
And another thing to be while you're out in the garden, and especially while you're weeding, you should really be keeping an eye out for bugs, right? Keeping an eye out for problematic bugs because they're really coming out.
Yeah, the heat of the summer, things are growing well, but also the bugs grow too. They have a way of hatching on out and finding our gardens. And so some of the things to watch for are the Colorado potato beetles and anything kind of nibbling on your vegetables. Now, there are a couple of products that I like to keep on my garden shelf because they're kind of widespread for whatever insect kind of is bugging. That's a good term. Is bugging us. And so I like the insecticide 7. 8 is another good one. That's a relatively new one, but a great one.
It's just the number 8?
Yeah, spelled out, EIGHT, 7. I suppose it's a play on 7, 8. I'm still waiting for 9 to come out.
Okay.
That should be really good. The organic product Spinosad is a great insect killer for many things. And the label will tell how to use and which insecticides to use it on, or which insects. Malathion is still, that's an old one, but still very good. And so read the labels carefully, but those are some good products to keep on one's shelf. For whatever. Oh, and the cabbage butterflies with those green cabbage worms that start eating holes and everything. When you see the cabbage butterflies, those white or sometimes yellow, kind of flitting around the cabbage patch, you know those cabbage worms aren't far away. And there is a product called B as in boy, T as in Tom. It's short for Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a natural bacteria that selectively will kill those larvae.
Oh, okay.
So that's another good one to have on hand for an organic choice. Oh, I might mention, as long as we're talking about insects, of course, we're all concerned about safety, and two organic products that are sometimes used. One is neem, and another is insecticidal soap. If you're using those on vegetables where you're having an insect problem, those products have to contact the body of the insect. And they don't have a residual, so it doesn't kill the insects when they come along and nibble on the leaves. They have to be applied thoroughly so that the insect body is coated with those materials. The other products that I mentioned have a residual on the leaf, and so that when the insects eat those, then the insect will die. The products also have the safe waiting period. These products break down, so there's a safe waiting period between the time you spray and the time you harvest. So there's a chart there usually that says for certain vegetable or fruit, here's the time in which you wait until you harvest.
And along those lines of, kind of keeping your fruits and vegetables clean from bugs, we should also be, for those people who have apple trees, it's a good time to stay on the spraying for apple trees to make sure that their health stays up.
It is, because the early part of July or even late June is time to spray for the apple maggot, which is that little worm. You usually don't see the worm, but when you harvest the apples and cut them open, they have brown streaks through them, and that's the apple maggot. And that adult fly continues to lay eggs on the apple, and then the eggs hatch into the maggot that goes inside. And they continue to do that until into August, so spraying every couple of weeks, every 7 to 10 days. With an apple maggot control insecticide. 7 or 8 or spinosad or malathion will work well.
And do you spray that on? I mean, I know that there will be directions there, but for people who are listening, do you spray that onto the leaves or onto the fruit?
That's a good point. You spray onto the leaves and the fruit, and these products will be well broken down by the time you harvest the fruit. And so you spray onto the leaves and the fruit, getting it with a good wetness to the point of runoff. So you don't continue to spray until it's, pouring off the tree, but just to the point where a little bit of it was starting to run off.
You want to see a little dripping.
So, coating the leaves and the fruit will prevent this fly from being able to lay its eggs.
Well, speaking of trees, we should also be looking at trees that are susceptible to suckers and making sure that there aren't sucker shoots coming off the base of these trees, right? Yeah,
there are a couple of trees that are kind of notorious for sending out these sucker shoots kind of from the point at which the trunk arises out of the ground. One are lindens. They oftentimes will get all these sprouts, and crab apples and apples. You can do that, ornamental crab apples, fruiting apples. And so cut those off right at their point of origin, as low as you can, to the trunk or the ground. And they'll probably resprout, but that's just something once a year or so you need to do. But I found that if you can get them as close to the trunk or close to the ground as possible and cut them off, sometimes if they're tender enough, I just take my hand and kind of bend them down, and that sprout will sometimes come off, and they're less apt to resprout the closer you get it to the trunk.
Is there any concern about, like some of these suckers, if you cut them off so close to the trunk, that are you leaving a wound essentially for the tree? Are you exposing because it's near the roots, are you exposing any danger there?
That's a good point. And that's a good case for getting those sprouts before their pencil-sized diameter.
Okay.
And then the wound that you'd be leaving is quite small, and the tree will heal itself over.
And the number one thing that people should be doing right now to really stay on top of is really just being in their garden and enjoying it, right?
And enjoying it, just reveling in this time of year. the weeding and I find the weeding fun, and harvesting and watching all the flowers. And so there's a lot of fun to be had, but just make sure that we just sit. I've got a garden bench, and sometimes I'm so busy that, I know the garden bench is there, but I purposely need to just go sit there sometimes, or sit on the front porch and look out onto it and just make sure that we take time to really enjoy everything we've got, because it is such a wonderful time of season.
Yeah, every time my girlfriend and every time Sam and I are out and we pull up in front of the house, there's usually about, like an extended, it's kind of like the NPR minute driveway moment, right? Where you're sitting in and you don't want to leave your car because you're listening to something. Well, for us, sometimes it's sitting in the car, and if it's really hot, sitting in air conditioning, and then looking at the front of the house and the front of the yard, and really kind of taking it in and talking about what we like and maybe what we don't want. And then before we even go into the house, we just walk up to there and we walk around, check out how things are doing, and really kind of, it's a kind of a pat on the back, but also a chance to really kind of take it all in.
And I think a lot of listeners will be nodding their head. Yeah, I think we all do that. That is fun.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, too, it's just, if after 5 o'clock or so to go out and sit in the backyard and and take that all in. And,
it is. That is fun, just to soak it all in, the fruits of our labor.
Yeah. Well, that's going to do it for another episode of Growing Together. Don, if people have questions, if they've had any questions about the things we've been talking about, or if they just have questions in general for you, what's the best way to reach you?
Yeah, give me an email. I like to hear from everyone. And my email is donald.kinsler@ndsu.edu.
All right. Well, that does it for another episode, and we will talk to you next week.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Growing Together, a gardening podcast, is sponsored by Bloomfield Garden Center, a family-owned retail greenhouse providing locally grown plants since 1974. You can find them 1 mile north of Sabin, Minnesota, or 6 miles south of I-94 at exit 6. Just a quick drive from Fargo-Moorhead.